Right. Good morning. Good morning. Danny. Danny?
Yeah.
Okay, do me a favor. I went to shul. I was locked out of the front room. There were two people working there last night, Benny Mesri and Isaacs. They were setting up new mechitzas, and they didn't put the key back where it belonged. So if you can text them and ask them, because we won't be able to get a Sefer Torah today if they don't open up the door.
But Isaacs is going to be there, no?
Just if you can text him and text Benny Mesri. Tell them that they did not, the key to the front door, they didn't put back. It's locked. I couldn't get in there.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Shekalim, Daf, Yud, Beis. We're going to learn an entire daf. It's a daf of Kachim, beginning with the Mishnah, Halacha Daled. What do we do with items that are fit for the Mizbeach, animals, or wine, oil, flour, etc.? And these items were consecrated by a person that did not specify when the person declared the items to be Hegdish, whether they are being designated Lemizbeach or whether they're being designated to go to the temple upkeep fund to the Belek Habayis. Now we're going to have in our Mishnah various opinions. We're going to have a machlekes amoyroyim, how to apply, exactly how to qualify the shitas of our Mishnah, as well as we're going to connect this to a sugya that we have in Tumura. Now Tumura is a din, that if an animal has a certain higher level of Kedusha, not that the animal was donated to the Beis HaMikdash. If the animal is already imbued with Kedushas Haguf, then if a person were to make a declaration and to say that a chulin animal should be the substitute, should be the Tumura of this original animal that has Kedushas Haguf, even though such a declaration should not be made, but if it was made, so the Torah says, V'hayahu utmurasei kodesh. But there's one rule over here, that the animal that's being used as the source of the substitution has to have so much Kedushas Haguf that if the temple would want to redeem it, they would have to wait for it to get blemished. If an animal only has Kedushas Damim, and therefore if they want to redeem it, they can just sell it, then that animal cannot be used as a source for Temura. And there are many details in the Mishnah there in Tumura which are going to be linked to the dinim that we are learning over here. There's going to be fascinating scenarios and arguments in the Gemara as to in certain cases, when you deconsecrate an animal, does it go out fully l'chulin or does it also have to get blemished? And all of that is connected to how much Kedusha did the animal have originally, for us to know how many steps need to happen for the animal to go out fully l'chulin, and much, much more. We're starting on Daf Yud Beis, Amid Aleph, all the way on top of the Amid, by the Mishnah Halah, by the fourth Mishnah of the Perek Halacha Dalet. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh b'dvar. Says the Mishnah, Hamagdish nechasav, a person made a declaration that my nechasav, my things, should become consecrated. What the person did not do is the person did not specify, is this going to the temple, to the temple's fund of the Bedek Habayis, or is it going to go on the Mizbeach? And the Mishnah is going to give three cases. Case number one, and the person owned items in his possessions that are worthy, that are fit to be communal karbanos, and as we already quoted this Mishnah yesterday, as Rabbi Yechanan will clarify, what are we referring to? Dafke ketoides. Now, exactly how does a private individual have ketoides? Again, we're going to review some details that we learned yesterday. But the first case in the Mishnah is speaking about ketoides. Now, if a person consecrated the ketoides, you can't say, okay, fine, let the Beis HaMikdash use it. Of course, the Beis HaMikdash cannot use it for ketoides, because ketoides must be purchased with the shekel fund. Furthermore, okay, so let the Beis HaMikdash purchase these shekalim with the shekel fund. They can't, because it's already holy. The shekel fund is used to buy things that are chulin. This person declared it already kodesh. So what needs to happen? Says our Mishnah that yinasnu leumanim b'scharam, that when the Beis Hamikdash owes money to professionals that perform services for the Beis Hamikdash, let them use this ketores to pay these professionals. And therefore what? So therefore the value, the kedusha of the shkalim, the kedusha of the ketores will become deconsecrated on their labor, oy gewalt. And now we are introducing a din that we dafke said otherwise up until now. In the series of Mishnahs that we learned until now, we were explaining that to deconsecrate Hegdish, it only functions if you are putting its kedusha on something tangible. Service that someone already did is not called tangible. Here we're learning one opinion, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that disagrees with that Nakuda. And he holds that Hegdish could become nifde on an intangible, on service. So first you use the ketores to pay a salary. And this will deconsecrate the ketores. And now that the ketores is chulin, the Mishnah doesn't have to speak it out. It's obvious. You take shkalim from the new shekel fund and you repurchase the ketores. And right away, this is the words of Rabbi Akiva. Amalei ben Azai tells him, Einem in Amida, right? This is not correct. And one thing is clear, that even Rabbi Akiva that says that here you are allowed to deconsecrate the kedusha that was imbued in the ketores because someone was magdish it onto a non-tangible service debt. Even Rabbi Akiva is maida in the previous Mishnah that such a thing may not be done. All of the 3 steps that the Mishnah mentioned and the 4th step that the Gemara added, the 1st step, even Rabbi Akiva is maida. We will see why. And that's what Ben Azai is telling him. Inim and Amida, right? You agreed with us in the last Mishnah. You can't deconsecrate the kedusha that's in the ketores on a salary. Ella, what needs to happen is, right? We take from the ketores that was donated the amount whose value is the value that's owed. First, you have to take money. Now we're going through all the steps, and you deconsecrate it on the money. And now that you have chulin the ketores v'noisen oisen little money, you pay the deconsecrated ketores to these workers. And now this is gavaldik. Now, just a very important nakuda. Rabbi Akiva holds, just to make this clear, Rabbi Akiva's takamoida that in the last Mishnah you have to go through all these steps, and the difference is like this. In the last Mishnah, that we were speaking about the surplus of ketores that was purchased with last year's Trumas Halishka fund. Even Rabbi Akiva's moida that something that was purchased with the Trumas Halishka fund cannot become deconsecrated on anything other than money. Masha'enkin over here, someone was magdish the ketores. So we're learning that there are different levels of kedusha. Something that only has kedusha, not because it came from a communal lishka fund, shekel fund, but because someone said that this is hegdish. Here, Rabbi Akiva holds this could become deconsecrated on a non-tangible, which is the service that is owed to the umana. Okay, moving on to case number 2. Hamagdish nechasav, same thing. A person made a declaration. My nechasim, my belongings are hegdish. And the person had in his possessions animals, and they were fit to go on the altar, meaning they were unblemished. And it's important to remember that really a person is not allowed to be magdish, a unblemished animal, to the bedek habayis. But here the person made a declaration. The person did not specify, is it for the bedek habayis, or is this animal consecrated as a korban? And let's add another detail, that there is a rule, as the Gemara will explain, that stam hegdish lebedek habayis. When a person says this is hegdish, it goes to the bedek habayis fund. On the other hand, animals that are unblemished should not be consecrated to the bedek habayis. So again, we don't know what this person meant. So we're going to have a 3-way machlokes tanoim. So and the animals had both male animals and female animals. So opinion number 1, Rabbi Eliezer says that zecharim yemachru letzarchei olam. Rabbi Eliezer's shita is stam hegdish lebedek habayis. None of these animals were consecrated to go on the altar. But on the other hand, since the animal is not blemished, and oila, which comes from a male animal, these animals are fit to be an oila. So these animals have to end up on the altar as an oila. But the person was not magdish it as an oila. So what are you going to do? Simple, says the Mishnah. Find a person who's obligated to bring a korban oila. That person is looking to buy an animal to offer it as an oila. Let that person buy this animal. Let that person buy this animal. So this animal will end up going on the base on the mizbeach. Likewise, if the female animals in this person's flock should be sold, a shlamim can be male or female. So let this animal be sold to someone who has to bring a korban shlamim. So the animal will end up being used as the shlamim. But the value that the Beis Hamikdash receives when they sell these animals, because so holds Rabbi Eliezer that even when the person has unblemished animals whose age and gender make these animals themselves fit to go on the altar, nevertheless, stam hegdish lebedek habayis. So this person's declaration that my nechasim are hegdish is not enough to have these animals actually placed as a korban. But on the other hand, he holds that the value of the animals should go to the bedek habayis, but the animals themselves should go on the mizbeach. That's opinion number one. Opinion number two, Rabbi Yeshua Omer, like this. There's a chadam atzvam yikru v'oilos. Then a kuda here, Rabbi Yeshua argues with Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yeshua holds that any animal that is fit as it is to go on the mizbeach, that will say that this person's declaration regarding this animal was not lebedek habayis, was la mizbeach. The person was magdish this animal to go on the mizbeach, so put it on the mizbeach as a korban. However, then
quick question: how much? How was the animal valued? Was it a market rate?
The market. Yeah. And on the cave, I said the female animals that are unfit to go as an oila, they should be sold to people that have to bring a shlamim. Same thing, because we want for this animal itself to eventually be put as a shlamim on the mizbeach. But v'yaviu b'domeyam oilos. It was really even the animals that cannot go on the mizbeach. The value of these animals should also be offered as oilos, because the person had in mind la mizbeach, and we'll see specifically as an oila. And the sha'ar nechasim, but items in this person's possession that is b'chlal not fit at all to go on the mizbeach. He had beds, he had furniture. There, nechasim yiplu lebedek habayis, which is a gavaldik chiddush, because this person made one declaration. He was magdish his nechasim, and we're splitting it. We're saying that he meant two things. Some of his nechasim should go to the mizbeach. Some of his nechasim should go to the bedek habayis. Now, Omar Rabbi Akiva, Roya Aniyas Divrei Eliezer, I will agree with Rabbi Eliezer. Makes more sense that everything is lebedek habayis. Medivrei Rabbi Yeshua, that some of it goes lamizbeach, because Rabbi Eliezer hishves midoisav. In other words, the person's statement is consistent. He made one statement: my nechasim are hegdish. Either he meant all mizbeach, either he meant all lebedek habayis. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Amachai, it's all lebedek habayis. And Rabbi Yeshua is interpreting a statement to be chilek. It depends on what, which is already a doichik, which is why Rabbi Akiva is siding with Rabbi Eliezer. Now, Amar Rabbi Papayis, Shomati, as Divrei Shneim, I understand how both of these opinions are correct. Hamagdish beferish, when the person states explicitly that my animals and my other possessions should be hegdish, since the person already separated, he was mafaresh, the animals versus everything else, and he did not say that the animals is lamizbeach, because he already was machalek, but he didn't fully say that my animals, lamizbeach, everything else, lebedek habayis. So that already implies that everything should be lebedek habayis, which is why then I will hold like Rabbi Eliezer. But if a person is magdish tam, so no inference can be learned from his lack of differentiating between lamizbeach and bedek habayis, because he kept everything so general. So there I will hold like Rabbi Yehoshua. And now the Mishnah goes into a third case. And the third case is not where the person was magdish as nechasav and he asked a toitus, not that the person was magdish as nechasav and he had animals, Now a person was magdish nechasav for hoyevehem devarim ru'uyim legavim mizbech, and there were items that are fitting on the altar, but they're not animals. What are they? He owned wines, yenois. He owned oil. He owned birds. Here, Rabbi Eliezer Oimer yimachru litzarchei oisa hamin v'yavi b'demeim oilois. Now, Rabbi Eliezer here, when he's writing that v'yavi b'demeim oilois, that's based on the understanding that he taka meant la mizbeach. Problem is, it's Rabbi Eliezer. So therefore, like many, we will learn that this shita is the opinion of the Tana Rabbi Elazar, not the Rabbi Eliezer of the Reisha. And indeed, this Rabbi Elazar is mamish holding like Rabbi Yeshua. And b'shar nechasim yiplul b'dei kabayis. So here again, we are being machalik, and we're saying that the items that can go on the altar, he had in mind la mizbeach. But when we have in mind la mizbeach, this another nuance, it's not that the items as they are go on the altar. La mizbeach means oila. So an animal that's a male that can be an oila is brought as an oila. All the other animals, first of all, they should be sold to people that have to bring wine. So the wine is going to go on the altar. The oil is going to go on the altar. But la mizbeach means le oila. So the mayim should become into a oilam. Okay, these are the three cases in the Mishnah, and we're going to further elaborate upon them here in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Magdish v'chulei likarbanei sibur. So the first case of the Mishnah did not clarify what item we are referring to. We already said we're speaking about ketoides, and indeed, that's the Rabbi Yochanan that says that the Mishnah is speaking about ketoides, and that was the discussion we had yesterday. Can ketoides be made by a private individual and actually being ground up, being prepared in a klei choil? So Rabbi Yochanan says yes, because of this Mishnah. Because if a ketoides has to be made in a klei sharis, so it's from its inception, it's already consecrated, that no one can own it to be magdish it. But on that, like we learned yesterday, Amar Rav Oishia, no, really, ketoides can also be made in a klei choil, and it can belong to a private individual. Where do you have a scenario that a person privately owns ketoides, tiftoid, based on what we learned in the last Mishnah? That with the ketoides that was made with the Trumas Halishka fund, even according to Rabbi Akiva, cannot be used directly and become deconsecrated, paying a salary. That has to be deconsecrated, and then you pay the umanim. And it could be that the umanim, before the hegdish brought it back, they were magdish nechasav, tiftar beuman, Michel Beis Haftinas, Shoyenoitel Beschari Ketoides, Gavaldik. End. So there's no raya from our Mishnah. Now the Gemara says, My Talmud Ben Azai. Why does Ben Azai disagree with Rabbi Akiva? These Ketoides were not bought, according at least to Rabbi Yochanan, they were not bought with the shekel fund, or even according to, let's go better, even according to Rabbi Oishia, the Ketoides right now belongs to an individual. So the She'ein, my Talmud Ben Azai, that disagrees with Rabbi Akiva, that holds that now that the Hegdish became again reconsecrated, right? So Rabbi Akiva says, okay, so weiter, pay umanim. Why can't you do that? Because he holds She'ein Hegdish Mischal Amalacha El Alamois. You cannot deconsecrate any Hegdish, even Hegdish that doesn't come from the shekel fund, even Hegdish that doesn't come from the Trumas HaShekel, Trumas HaLishka fund. You want to deconsecrate Hegdish, you have to put its Kedusha on something that is tangible. That's the big machloikus. And so we learned until now. Okay, again, very important to remember that even Rabbi Akiva is moide in the previous Mishnah that you have to undergo through the 4-step process, to make that clear. Because Ketoides that has in it the Kedusha of the Trumas HaLishka cannot be paid to Umanim. It cannot become deconsecrated on non-tangibles. Our Mishnah is different. It's Chulin that became Hegdish because someone made such a statement. This should be Hegdish. Okay, night. Tanon, we learned over there Mishnah and Tamura. Yesh bekachi b'dei kabayis. The Mishnah there is comparing b'dei kabayis kedusha versus mizbeach kedusha. Now people would say, mizbeach kedusha is much greater. Yes and no. We're going to learn 4 dinim in which something that is imbued with the kedusha of the b'dei kabayis fund is more chamor over the mizbeach fund. Number 1, shestam ekdeishus leb'dei kabayis. And by the way, this statement appears to be Rabbi Eliezer. That's the premise of his shita. Rabbi Yeshua, he argues with Rabbi Yeshua because the person said Hegdish, he didn't clarify it, and he meant all the Bedek Habayis. And number two, Hegdish, Bedek Habayis Chal Ala Koil. If a person is donating to the Bedek Habayis fund, what is donating to the Bedek Habayis fund? Everything. A person can donate wood, you can donate rocks, you can donate your table, furniture. To the Mizbeach, you can only make a declaration on something that's Ro'oi La Mizbeach. Number three, Moy Alam Bigiduleim. If you had an item, let's say a person was Magdish Lebedek Habayis, an animal, what is the status of the milk that the animal produces, or of the wool that is shorn off the animal, or the children? So there's a big difference. Benegea Me'ila, they're all Hegdish, Geduli Hegdish. But the great punishment of Me'ila is only on the Gedulim of Bedek Habayis, but on something that came from Kedushas Mizbeach, it's Taka Kadosh. But if someone misappropriated it, they're not going to be Chayiv Me'ila. And number four, Ve'ein Behem Hanoya L'Kohanim. Anything that goes on the Mizbeach, Kohanim have some part of it. You know what? Even by an oila, the hide of the oila goes to the Kohanim. Epis. Bedek Habayis is full, all of it belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so now that we had these four dinim, the first was Stam Hegdeshus Lebedek Habayis, says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Chananya. I want you to know that the author of this Mishnah in Temura, the Rab, again without the Aleph, the Rab Eliezer, because as we learned in our Mishnah, the Taninan, Hamagdash Nechasav, the second case in our Mishnah, and even Rabbi Eliezer says, they themselves don't go on the Mizbeach, because the person's declaration did not mean La Mizbeach. Now, the animal, because there's a rule that whenever the Bedek Habayis owns an animal that's fit for the altar, that animal has to ultimately be placed on the altar. So, but Yemachru, right? Yemachru l'tzarchi oilos. Nekevos, Yemachru l'tzarchi zivchei shlamim. V'demeim yiplum sha'nachasim, to what? All of it goes lebedek habayis, because of the rule of Stam Hegdeshus lebedek habayis. Amar Rabbi Yechanan Tamid Rabbi Eliezer, because it says in Parshas Michal Koisei v'ishki yagdish es beisoi. So it says kodesh lashem. Now, what is the case of that pasuk? V'manon kaminon. If the person was Taka Magdish his home, that cannot be the case of this verse, because it says in the very next pasuk, Kvar Ksiv V'im HaMagdish Yigal As Beisoy. You know, and all of the dinim of where the bias was in a walled city and an unwalled city, but this pasuk, right, is not speaking about the Ikdish Ki Yagdish As Beisoy, that it's the house itself. Elo Ki Anon Kaminon, it must be the case of the pasuk is that the person was Magdish his Nechasav. And what does the Torah say? Kodesh Lashem, guys, Kodesh Lashem, just to know what it means. Kodesh Lashem never means La Mizbeach. Kodesh Lashem means that it belongs to the Beis HaMikdash with all the ditim that we have over there in Bechuk Koisei. And the Beis HaMikdash has to sell it, and the money goes for temple upkeep. So Mikan, that's the source of Rabbi Eliezer, which is also the source of the Mishnah that we just quoted in Temura, that Stam Hegdesha is Lebedek Habayis. Amar Rabbi Zeiram, I want you to know that the Rab Chuna says in the name of Rav, Bameh Peligin, we're going to have now a machloikis amoraim that will limit the machloikis in our Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. The case of the Mishnah according to Rav is only the Magdish Nechasav, and Magdish Nechasav means that he had in his possessions both items that are fit to go on the Mizbeach and other items as well. And that is exactly why Rabbi Eliezer wanted for everything to go to the same place. Like Rabbi Shua was the Machadesh. He meant La Mizbeach, that which can go on the Mizbeach. He meant Lebedek Habayis, that which is unfit for the Mizbeach. All this person said as being Magdish my Nechasim. So that's you see why there's room for argument. But if a person only owned animals, Avol the Magdish Edra, he only had a flock. He only had animals. Says Rav, Kol Alma Moidoi, everyone will agree, right? Even Rabbi Eliezer will hold Shehul HaMizbeach. Didn't we just learn that Stam Hegdish Lebedek Habayis? So there's another rule, that a person is not allowed to be Magdish Lebedek Habayis, unblemished animals that are fit for the Mizbeach. Like we mentioned, and if the person was magdish those animals that are fit for the mizbeach, for the Bedek Habayis, but they're fit for the mizbeach, even though he was not magdish al mizbeach, the temple has to see to it that these animals make it on the mizbeach. That's why we had all these rules in the Mishnah. That if it's a zachar, l'tzarchei oilos, if it's an akeva, l'tzarchei shlamim. So even though yes, tam hegdish lebedek habayis, if the animal is fit for the altar, he takement la mizbeach. Gavaldik. In our Mishnah there's a machlokes, yeah, because in our Mishnah there were also other nechasim. The other nechasim were not fit for the altar. So not to be machalik his words, which is a big doichak, that's where we say, Rabbi Eliezer, he meant everything la mizbeach.
What?
That's opinion number one. Now, Rabbi Ba says, in the name of Rav, the same Rav, Punkt verkehrt, that ma pligin only b'magdish edroi. Rabbi Eliezer says it's all about the kabayis, because tam hegdish lebedek kabayis. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Rabbi Yeshua says no. If the animals are fit to go on the altar, he meant la mizbeach. However, Abba b'magdish nechasav, and he had both items that are fit for the altar, and he had all the other stuff that people own. Then call amal midoy, that is, it should go lebedek kabayis. Gavaldik. Okay. Now the Gemara says, Al dati de Rav Zeira, which is the first version of what Rav said. Nicha. Everything we learned fits in the Mishnah. However, but Bekashya al the Rabbi Ba. Why? Because Rabbi Ba is saying that they argue only where a person only has an edroi. So he's asking, Behema loyla mizbeachi. How can there even be a shita that says that the person had anything other than the mizbeach in mind? So the Gemara says no. The Gemara says behema should have gone la mizbeach, but when a person is magdish something la mizbeach, they have to say that. The person doesn't say on an animal, "I'm being magdish the animal." When you're magdish something for the mizbeach, you say, "I'm being magdish this." La'olam, l'shlamim. You say for what? And therefore, by the fact we infer from this person's lack of clarifying, as one should have, so it's as if he said it should only go to the Bedek Habayis. And even though the person should not have done it, and there's a violation of that, nevertheless, that's what the person really meant to say. Okay, now we have a third understanding of the machlokes in the Mishnah. The third
Rabbi.
Yes.
Shouldn't we ask the person, what did you meant for? If he says he meant something.
Very good. So Shlem is asking a very important question, and we have this all over Kachim. So there's two approaches. One approach is that the person said, I said stam. Said stam. That's one way of understanding it. All right? And the other approach is that the person is no longer here. He's not here to ask it. Okay, right. Rabbi Yechanan says this again. There's a third way of understanding the machlokes in the Mishnah.
Hey, Rabbi, according to that explanation, if he actually clarified and said, "Oh, I actually meant animals for bedek habayis," even though you're not supposed to do that, we would say itaka goes for bedek habayis.
I think so. I know this is discussed a lot. Yeah, there might be a machlokes about this under the Rishonim. Yeah, says the Gemara loy shanyahi. Loy shanya means we do not differentiate. Not an answer. We don't make a shinoi. They argue always. Sai is leishanya, comma. He hamagdish nechasav, he hamagdish edrei. No matter if he only owned animals or if he owned other things as well, always he hamachloikes nikudam. Now we're gonna skip the parentheses. Let's just go back to the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. What does Rabbi Eliezer hold? That all of the animals go the bedek habayis. Okay, so what happens? What did we say? Let's go through the steps. So the Mishnah says that first thing, you take the animals and you sell it to people who need to bring that animal because of the other din, that whenever the Bedek Habayis owns an animal that's fit for the Mizbeach, that animal has to be brought to the Mizbeach, but it belongs to the Bedek Habayis. So you sell it to a Jew that has to bring an oil. Now let's go through the steps. When that happens, so the money that the Hegdish gets has the Kedusha now, right? And the animal that person bought, normally, the animal goes out l'chulin. That's the way it normally works. No, let's amagdish this animal. This animal has kedushas bedek habayis. when a Jew buys it, let's follow the holiness. So the Bedek Habayis gets the gelt. The gelt now has the Kedusha of the Bedek Habayis. The animals l'choira go out l'chulin. Now, one second. The Jew that bought it will then say, this animal is from my oila. It's going to end up on the Mizbeach. But when the Beis HaMikdash sold it to the Yid that has to bring the oila, which means that the original Kedusha went on the money that they're getting from that Yid. So the question is, what is the exact status of that animal? Now, why are we asking that question? So let me say the following. When an animal was consecrated lamizbeach, and then it gets blemished, and you redeem the animal, if you remember from Kachim, which is what the Beis HaMikdash is going to do, the animal is never fully chulin. Being that it was once fit to go on the Mizbeach, there's a certain remnant of the Kedusha, and there are restrictions. You can shech the animal and eat it, but you can't, also begiza, right? You can't shear the animal, you can't work with the animal, and even when it comes to shechting and eating it, remember those details, you can't sell it in the meat market. You have to be noyeg a certain amount of respect because this animal was once fit to go on the altar. The next topic that we're going to be discussing here is this animal, according to Rabbi Eliezer, was only designated lebedek habayis. So when it was sold, and the guy that bought it will have to be magdish it. But before he's magdish it, what status does it have? Is it completely chulin, or is it also, since it was bedek habayis, and since the animal needs to go on the mizbeach? So before he's magdish, there are some restrictions on it. That's the question. So Rab Chuna, in the name of B'Shem Rav, and Rabbi Bohu, in the name of Rabbi Yechanan. So both Rav and Rabbi Yechanan hold Kachi Bedek Habayis, Shepoidan, Temimim. Right? They completely go out l'chulin. Now again, guys, it's important to remember the person who bought it, animals that are Temimim, have to end up on the altar, even though they were given to the Bedek Habayis. Fine, he has to be magdashit la'oila. You only sold it to people that have to bring an oila. That's called l'tzarchi oila, l'tzarchi shlamim. But between his purchase until his reconsecration, lamizbeach, it's completely chulin. And therefore, you can work with it, and if it has milk, you can use the milk, and you can shear it v'chuli. And why is that? Because indeed, masnisin amrakein. There is a Mishnah that indicates, the Mishnah is already a stretch. The Mishnah that they are referring to is a Mishnah in Chulin. There, the Mishnah is Bechlal not speaking about Bedek Habayis. The Mishnah in Chulin says, now when do we say that an animal that was Nigdash Lamizbeach, that becomes blemished, and then it is sold, still has a vestige of Kedusha? If that animal was once Tamim, it was once unblemished when it was holy, so it was Mamish Ro'i Lamizbeach. But the Mishnah in Chulin says, if you have an animal that before you consecrated it lamizbeach, it was already blemished, which means it never would have gone on the altar. And you were magdish it. Now you have to redeem it. Such an animal, after you redeem it, completely goes l'chulin. The Mishnah says that v'ladan v'chalban muter la'achar pidyoinum. So we're making it, now don't forget, the Mishnah in Chulin is dafka speaking about a blemished animal. Here we're speaking about an unblemished animal. Doesn't matter. The connection that Rav and Rabbi Yechanan are making from the Mishnah and Chulin is that an animal that it itself was going to go on the Mizbeach as it was. A person is magdish, an animal kedushas Mizbeach, an unblemished animal. There is where we say that if before they offered the carbon, it becomes blemished, and now the Beis HaMikdash sells it, even though it's sold, it's not fully Chulin. Same thing over here. And if the animal milachatchila was blemished, then they were magdashit lamizbeach. It has to be nifta. But once it's nifta, it goes completely lechulin. So they're saying any animal that wasn't for a moment going to be going on the altar, same thing as with an animal that was nigdash labedek habayis. Right before someone is going to be magdashit lamizbeach, which is where it needs to go, that animal was never going to go on the altar. So it makes sense that when you're pointed, it goes completely l'chulin daf yud beis amid beis. And
so Rabbi, if it's l'chulin, so let's say I'm that guy and I buy that animal to use as a korban, but I haven't been magdish it yet. If that animal is pregnant and has a baby, what's with the vlad? Is it?
It's yours. It's yours.
It's mine.
Yes. That's the whole point. However, Rab Chizkiah, Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, in the name of Rab Chizda, now guys, that's a big, Rab Chizda is arguing with both Rav and Rabbi Yechanan. Wow. No, he says that Tiftoim, that understand the comparison, Shepedon Temimim, and only then Vuhumamu. He says, 1 second. I will agree that if the person who bought this animal that was Lebedek Habayis, and then not only was it redeemed, but then it gets blemished, then I'll be moida. Then I'll be moida that it goes out completely l'chulin, which, by the way, is still more lenient than an animal that was consecrated lamizbeach. Because if an animal was consecrated lamizbeach, and even though it's blemished and it's redeemed, doesn't make a difference. Since it was once going to go on the mizbeach, it never goes out completely l'chulin. It's always going to be asur begiza uba avoida. Here, I agree, says Rab Chizda, that if this animal not only was sold, was redeemed, therefore, and also it got blemished, fine, now it's completely chulin. But if it's still in an unblemished state, and let's add a nuance, the guy who bought it has to bring it for his oila. The Beis Hamikdash only sold this animal to someone who was going to be bringing this animal for a korban, even though the original owner was only Magdash at Lebedek Habayis, because this is the rule that we're learning, that if an animal that's unblemished was donated to the Lebedek Habayis, which it should not have been, but it's only Lebedek Habayis, but this animal has to be put on the Mizbeach. Point is, we don't say that just Pidia brings it out l'chulin. You need pedia and a blemish. Rabbi Yosef B'Shem Rab Chizda actually is going to bring a Mishnah which is going to back up Mas Nisan Amrakein. The Mishnah says, and now we're quoting a Mishnah from Tamura. There it says clearly that Veladon, Danny, the Veladon, the Chelban Asur la'achar pidyoinam. That's the case over there. The Mishnah there is speaking about this statement on an animal that was originally going to go on the mizbeach, and then it was sold because it had a blemish. Still, like the v'ladan is asur. And the Mishnah, by the way, the Gemara doesn't quote here the continuation of the Mishnah in Tamura. The Mishnah there says clearly that if there was an animal that was consecrated lebedek habayis, the Mishnah says if it was both redeemed and blemished, then v'ladan v'chelban mutar. Clearly. It's not enough to be poida it. It has to be nifda, of course, and it has to be blemished. That's l'chayda clearly against Rav and Rabbi Yechanan. So says the Gemara that the Rabbi Chizkiah b'Shem Rabbi Yoisa says that koche bedek habayis shepedan temimim, yes, completely goes out l'chulin. In other words, this Rabbi Yoisa, this Rabbi Chizkiah is now supporting the Shita of Rav and Rabbi Yechanan, which holds, again, that you don't need for it to have a blemish. That's the machlekes here. And he explains himself that in Tamar, and I'll prove it to you, that if you're going to say that lo yotza l'chulin, that the animal doesn't completely go out l'chulin, then how do you understand our Mishnah? If something is already holy, there is no room for you to put new holiness on it. So he says a gavaldik question. What did we learn in our Mishnah? Let Rabbi Eliezer. What was the case? A person was magdash nechassav. Rabbi Eliezer understands lebedek habayis. But there's a rule. These animals have to make it on the altar. So the Mishnah says, Yimachru l'tzarchei oilos. So you sell it to a Jew that has to bring an oila. Now, if before that Jew was magdash, if there is still some vestige of kedusha on it, how can he now say this animal is lemizbeach? It's still holy. Something, by the way, that has kedushas bedek habayis cannot be designated lemizbeach. It first has to become chulin, and now there is room in it, so to say, for you to put a new kedusha. By the very fact that the Mishnah gives this klal of yimachru l'tzarchei oilos, that is a raya that it became chulin. And don't tell me that our Mishnah is speaking about it became chulin and it became later blemished. Because if it became blemished, then how can you put it la'olam? Yamarchu l'tzarchei oilos, you want it to go on the mizbeach, not you want it to get blemished. Gevaldik. So the Gemara says that this will not, now this really is a huge kasha on Rab Chizda. So how can Rab Chizda say that it only goes out l'chulin when it's redeemed and it's blemished? So says the Gemara that Balei Mumin Kache that when did you say that you need for it to have a mum as well? That's only midrabanan. And kache mizbeach, if you redeemed it and it's not blemished, even according to Rab Chizda, really kache mizbeach will be chal on it. Because Rab Chizda also holds that mida oiraisa, it does go out fully lechulin only after it's redeemed. Benegea, what did Rab Chizda say? It also has to have a blemish. Leda mila, for what halacha? That midrabanan, the Rabbanan said like this: the kabayis only sold it to someone who's going to be put it on the mizbeach, and they had a concern. Someone is going to buy this animal. Someone who tells the bedek kabayis, I have to bring an oila. I'll buy this animal oila, and knowing that it's mamish chulin, maybe this person will end up never being magdashit. Maybe he'll be magdash another animal. You know why? Like Danny, because it's pregnant. He wants to have the vlad, or he whatever for whatever reason. So the Rab Chizda just said that midrabanan, they said that's also because of avoid. But be'emes, it's completely chulin. And this really reconciles the contradictions in the Mishnayos. The Kitzur, bottom line is that Rav and Rabbi Yechanan don't even subscribe to that. They don't even subscribe to this Rabbanan. It goes out completely the chulin. Rab Chizda's chumrah is only on a rabbinic level. Let's go right.
Rabbi, can you clarify one thing? According to Rab Chizda, once it has a mum, can you then now just shecht it and eat it for dinner?
You have to. You can do anything for sure.
So at that point, there's no kedusha in it at all.
Correct.
Not just about giza and
correct. Like 100%. Right.
Okay.
Hamafrish, guys, we're learning a braisa. Hamafrish nekeva lo yilasi. Now here we're not speaking about someone who's magdish something lebedek habayis. Here we're speaking about someone who's being magdish something lamizbeach. But the item that he was magdish was never fit lamizbeach. So, for example, a female animal was designated to be an oila. An oila has to be male. A female animal was designated for a pesach. We learned this in the last Masechta. A pesach has to be zachar ben shana. Zachar. A female animal was consecrated to be an asham, and the asham has to be male. Yeah, true, there are 6 ashamis. Some of them have to be dafka within the year. Some of them have to be dafka within the second year. But the gender of the animal from the outset was never the right gender for that korban. Now, the question is like this. Benegea to tumura, like we spoke on in the intro, an animal that has kedushas bedek habayis can never be the source of a tumura. Can't. An animal that is a source for a tumura, you can't say the animal has to be mamish as it is be royal on mizbeach. That's a guzma. Even an animal that was designated on mizbeach, but the animal cannot go on the altar. For example, it's blemished, could also be the source of a tumura. Why? Because it has kedushas haguf. Now, this is the criterion. Any animal that cannot be sold as it is, cannot be sold as it is. It needs at least a blemish for it to be sold. Such an animal could be the source of a tumura. An animal that, as it is, could be redeemed, can no longer be the source of a tumura. So if a person was mafresh, an animal which is a female, la'oila, right, le-pesach, le-oila, le-pesach, le-asham, says the Tanakama, it still could be the source of it can be the source of a tumura. Even though the animal cannot, you said a female animal or oila, it's not going to be an oila. But that's the klal. The Tanakama holds such an animal cannot right now be sold. You have to wait for it to get a blemish for it to be sold, even though it's not fit to go on the altar. As long as you still need to wait for the animal to get blemished in order for the Beis HaMikdash to be able to sell it, that means that there is enough kedushas haguf in it, even though it's not roy lamizbeach. That's why many times be'emes, when you say kedushas haguf and kedushas mizbeach, they don't exactly mean the same thing. Kedushas mizbeach means that this itself, as it is, can go on the altar. This nekeva cannot go l'oila. But since it's a tamim animal, and the Beis HaMikdash will have to sell it and use its funds l'oila, or the owner will have to sell it and use its funds l'oila. but you have to wait for it to get blemished, it could be the source of a tamura. However, Rav Shimon says like this: in the case of a female lo'oila, he's maidam that oisa tamura. There is enough kedusha in it that allows it to be a source of a tamura. But if the female animal was designated for a pesach or for a asham, Rav Shimon holds that this animal may be sold even without a blemish. And Eino Oisa Tamura. Now, why does he differentiate this version of Rav Shimon between a Pesach and an Asham on one hand, and the oil on the other hand? I'll speak it out by heart, because since when it comes to a oilas ha'oif, there is an oila by a bird, and by a bird we don't care about the gender. So since in the world of an oila there is a scenario where we don't care whether it's male or female, even though by an animal we do care, it's still, you have to wait until it gets blemished. But that's always going to be the same nekuda. And since by the Pesach and the Asham there is never a scenario where female is brought, so there's no female at all in the world of Pesach and an Asham. So therefore the Beis HaMikdash is able to sell it, the owner is able to sell it even without a blemish. And that's why it cannot be the source of a tamura. Now, there's another version, Vishitas Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rab Shimon that in all cases, La'ilasai, Ula Pischai, Ula Shamai, arguing with the Tanakama, never Eino Oisa Tamura, because they all can be sold even without blemishes. Now, Omar Rabbi Yechanan, I want you to know the reason of Rab Shimon, not the latter version of Rab Shimon. The Rab Shimon, as he's quoted in the Baraisa, Shekalim Motzino Nekeva Ba'oif Ksheira Lavi Oila, like we just explained what this means. So since in the universe of a oila and a bird oila, you can bring a female animal, so you can bring a female bird. So even though an animal has to be male, but you have to wait until it gets blemished, and therefore it has enough kedusha for it to be used as a source of a substitution. And Rabbi Yechanan, the reason Tama that Rab Shimon ben Yehuda b'shitas Rab Shimon is that no, he disagrees with that. He disagrees that Rab Shimon ever said that a animal oila has that higher level of kedusha, and he has a raya for that. Imin b'minoi hu chaluk alav. If even in a case when you have an unfit animal of the same gender, we'll explain what that means. Because what happens if there's an animal that has the right gender but it's in the wrong year? We know that Rab Shimon explicitly say that it doesn't attain kedusha haguf at all. We'll give that case. So in our case, where it's male and female, min b'she'ena minoi, for sure, Rab Shimon never said that it attains any kedushas haguf. Now the Gemara clarifies, "Ezeu min b'minoi shu chaluk alav is kahadad tani." We have another brayse. The brayse says like this: that asham, that is an asham that is required to be brought from an animal that's ben shana, and the person who's bringing the asham erroneously or whatever, b'mezid, he decided to consecrate an animal that's 2 years old, the correct gender, the wrong age. Or he needed to bring an animal that's ben shtayim, and the chacham was magdash an animal that's ben shalish. So the Tanakama says that what? That lo yatsa. Now really, it's hard to read these words, so we're going to go with the version of the Gra. Now the Gra is an ois dalid. So says the Gra, osam ben shana, vehevi ben shtayim, or ben shtayim, vehevi ben shalish, vehevi ben shana, kasher. You bring that animal. It's not going to count for his obligation. We're going to focus on Rab Shimon, which we have by us. We're reading all in the Gra, Dalid, Rab Shimon Oimed, Kol Atzman Eino Kaddish, and Gavaldik. So Gavaldik. So if the problem is only age, but so what? If the Torah said Ben Shana, if you're Magdish Ben Shtayim, if Rab Shimon is saying in this Baraisa that it's Bechlal not Kaddish, it doesn't need to be blemished to sell it, then Avadeh, if it's the wrong gender, for sure it's never nigdash. Okay, says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Rab Shimon. This is Rab Shimon ben Yehuda's version of Rab Shimon. And our Mishnah, now we'll understand why the Gemara is bringing this, and the Rabbi Yeshua both hold the same shita, which is Kima, just like the Rabbi Yeshua of our Mishnah says that nekeva lo oila lo kitcha ela hegdish damim, as the Gemara will explain in a moment. Therefore, if there was an nekeva lo oila, only kedushas damim, right? The tzarchi oilos was the zachar. The Gemara will explain in a moment. So Kain Rab Shimon Amar that nekeva lo oila lo kitcha ela kedushas damim. which is again why beneged the dinei temura. That's something that only has kedushas damim, which means that the Beis Hamikdash can sell it even without a blemish, is never enough kadosh to affect a substitution. Now, in Tamar, because if we're going to say, we're going to explain now over here the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua, that in the Mishnah, that kacha, even kedushas haguf. What did the Mishnah say about a female animal? Remember, what did the Mishnah say? You sell it for people that need a shlamim. Did the Mishnah, did Rabbi Yeshua say, first animal has to get blemished and then sell it to someone who has to bring a shlamim? No, fakert. No, you sell it as it is to someone who has to bring a shlamim. You don't have to have the blemishing. Now, guys, anything that has kedushas haguf cannot be sold without it being blemished. In Taman, in our Mishnah, the Mishnah spoke about Zecharim and Nekevos. That's part of the Mishnah. That Kacha Kedushas Haguf, then Rabbi Yeshua should have said Yiru. He doesn't say that, right? We learned in the Mishnah, all he says is that Oilois Yimachlu Tzachar Oilois. At least by the Oila, the Zachar is taka worthy. Nekevos Yimachlu Tzachar Shlamim. Gavaldik. Without need of having a blemish. Without the need of it having a blemish at all. Okay, and again, don't forget, Chavra, another Nakuda, is that according to Rabbi Yeshua, the Nekevos, the money that the Beis Hamikdash gets is Lamizbeach. Rabbi Yeshua is Machalik. Rabbi Yeshua holds that the money that the Beis Hamikdash gets from the person who has to bring a shlamim should be used for an oila. But still, it doesn't have to get blemished. Is that I that if you got that since the person meant all the oila, Taka yemachru lezivchei shlamim, because that's the klal. Any animal that's unblemished, that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash, has to end up on the mizbeach for what it's good to end up on the mizbeach. So it has to be brought as a shlamim. But the donor meant la'oila, but it wasn't a keva. You don't have to mamish gavaldik, and you don't have to have a blemish. So therefore, they hold up they are. If the gender is off, it never gets any kedushas haguf. Says the Gemara, Rebbe. Amar Rebbe, now we're going to add the girsa of Ein, even though it's not in our Gemara. If not, it's not going to flow. And this is not stam. There are many that have in their Gemaras Ein. Amar Rebbe, Ein ani roya es divrei Rab Shimon b'Pesach. I disagree with Rab Shimon when it comes to Pesach. Doesn't seem correct when he says, we're speaking about the second Tana in the Mishnah, not Rab Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Rab Shimon, but Rab Shimon himself. The Rab Shimon that subscribes to the fact that when it comes to an animal oila, even though it's female, there is kedusha saguf, because a bird oila can be female. Well, oy bazoi, why don't we say the same thing by a Pesach? Rab Shimon should have said the same thing by a Pesach. Why should he have said the same thing by a Pesach? After the parentheses, guys, we're learning these dinim, because what happens to every Moiseh Pesach? Any surplus of a Pesach becomes a shlamim. A shlamim can be brought as a female. So there is also a female in the universe of a Pesach. So that's the kasha that Rebbe has. Now the Gemara has a question on Rebbe's question. Why did Rebbe only ask by a Pesach? Rebbe L'choyda could have asked more. Why didn't Rebbe also say, Ein ani royes divided Rabbi Shimon ba'asham? Why? Because there's another klal, my friends, that any moised asham, every moised asham is brought for an oila. Guys, remember that, because an asham like a chatos, if you didn't sin, you can't stand bring it. So in the scenarios where the moised chatos now is a moised asham like a chatos, are the 5 chatois hamesois. So whatever the rules are, by wherever an asham, whenever there's a moised asham, it goes la'oila. Now, the moment an asham goes for an oila, what did we learn about an oila? Since by an oila, by a bird, you can bring a female, even though the asham itself has to be male, but it's still in the universe of a female. So again, the same logic of Rab Shimon. Why didn't Rebbe ask further? So on that, Amar Rab Abin, no. Im higdish Pesach. I get Rebbe's kasha only on Pesach, because the Pesach itself, sometimes whenever the Pesach comes bishlamim, so what happens? That animal is brought as a shlamim. Gufay karev shlamim. However, im higdish asham ba'oila, I know, you're right, that there are scenarios where a surplus of an asham comes as an oila. But in those scenarios, you know what happens? It's not that this animal itself is brought out, it has to be sold. Its funds are used as it, so it's that far removed. And gufay karav law, and that's why Rebbe did not ask Beneged the Asham. Now says Gemara, my kedoin. What are they disagreeing about? Here we're going back to Rav Shimon and Rebbe. Rav Shimon and Rebbe says the Gemara Hadain Amar. This one says that's Rav Shimon that higdish damim or hegdish damim is higdish. What does that mean, guys? Look inside the tiklin chadatin under the carbon ha'eda. Normally it would be like under the Tosfos, the first line. Hahein Amar, the first wide line. Hegdish damim kaddish. That Rav Shimon sfiralei. That the loynachsa kedusha saguf at all. Why? Mishum de moisrei by shlamim. Just because it's if there is a moisa, if there's a surplus, it comes as a shlamim. Doesn't matter. There's no kedusha saguf, which is why it doesn't affect the temura. The hahachi ein gufay kadif shlamim kedamed betemura. That's a very important din. That nishtayra achara pesach. Whenever there's a female animal. What happens if you have a female animal that was designated for a Pesach? And it's after Pesach. Do you bring this as a shlamim? You can say a shlamim could come as a female. But since it was designated as a Pesach, and a Pesach can never come as a female, even though its value will be used for a shlamim, Rav Shimon holds that Eina itself is not going to be offered as a shlamim. Why? Hoyel umachmas kedusha psula ka'asi. The itchumi Pesach. Because it was a female. So even though Moisei Pesach becomes a shlamim, Rav Shimon holds it itself will never be brought as a shlamim. That's the reason why Rav Shimon...
That answers his question.
That answers this question. And Masha Enken Rebbe, v'hahin savad, let's go back in the Gemara, you can keep your finger in the tiklin, and hahin, v'hahin omer, the hahin is Rebbe holds that no. He holds that even something that comes from a kedusha, the chuya, this itself will be used as a shlamim. It will never be offered as a Pesach. But since a female is good as a shlamim, the Amar Hegdish Gufay is Hegdish Chaval Azman. You know what? We have to run weiter. We'll chap until the next two lines. Says the word two dots. Rab Zeira, guys. Now we are explaining the shita of Rabbi Yeshua. This is so gavaldik. That what does Rabbi Yeshua hold? He holds that whatever is fit to go on the altar is Hegdish Lamizbeach. But Rabbi Yeshua holds that what it has to be brought oilos. So the females. They have to be sold at Sarche Shlamim, but the money is used la'oilos. Rabbi Zira says in Mishnah and Lakish, what's the source of Rabbi Yeshua that the funds have to be used for an oilah? Because it says in Parshas Emor, David al-Aron vel kol ben Yisrael, the Martaleim, ish mebeis Yisrael, v'goymen, asher yakriv l'Hashem le'oilah, end of quote, says the Gemara, that means hakoil karav le'oilah. And that's why, even though the female animal that's sold at Sarche Shlamim, the funds are used for a oilah. When the pasuk says "Vayter lirit soin chem tamim zacher," right? That we are saying for it to be favorable to you, God, lirit soin chem, it has to be zachar tamim. That's referring to a Pesach. Minayin afilu nekevos. We're speaking about an oilah that it will have the kedusha of a oilah. So Talmud Leimer babakar lerabos eshan nekeva, which is how ironic, right? It says zachar, but the words babakar, any cattle, the Torah doesn't differentiate. That includes also nekevos, that its funds have to be used for a oilah as well, even though there's never a nekeva in oil. Rabbi Yitzchak Bey, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Elazar Sha'al, he says, I don't understand. It says zachar, and you're telling me that the word babakar, which is a generic word that does not differentiate in gender, how can that include a nekeva? He's asking, when the Torah says tamim, so are you going to tell me that since it says babakar and it doesn't say babakar dafka unblemished, so babakar should include bali mumin? Of course you won't say that, because the Torah says tamim. So my benayu, how can you be marbe even a female animal's funds going when the Torah says zachar? Answers the Gemara. Rav says he can't compare one case to the other. Shifta the chad kida, a thick stick that are used by weavers. It's just a thick keli. It differentiates ones in the other because cattle does include females. Cattle, bakar is males and females. So the gender is b'chlal not specified, but it's not shaykh ever to have a balamumin brought on the mizbeach. So for sure, we're never being married by el balamumin. Bottom line is that whenever you have an animal that's designated la mizbeach, but it's an akeva, the funds of that animal has to go le'oila, to be continued.
But didn't we say sometimes it goes as a shlamim? So what?
The animal itself, the animal itself has to be used as a shlamim. That's another din. That any unblemished animal that belongs to that has to end up for its purpose. But the magdish, the funds of that animal, has to go la'oila. So they're going to sell it to someone who has to bring a shlamim. So this animal is going to go with shlamim.
Rabbi,
the funds go to
tomorrow morning, and then not again until Tuesday.
Tomorrow morning is normal time, and the next time will be, God willing, the first day Chol HaMoed. Then we'll determine whether we're going to learn at 5 a.m. or at 6 a.m. L'chaim.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Okay, thank you.